Bungie gave us an absolutely ridiculous TWID yesterday with a ton of sandbox changes, but one of the biggest areas was changes to how melee works. The biggest part here is that melee damage buffs will now be additively stacked instead of multiplicatively stacked, which sounds like math, and luckily you've come to the right person. I saw that and I was like, I was made for this video. So I'm going to be breaking down all that. I'm going to be doing some total buff comparisons based on this news and what we know so far, so you can compare where we sit currently in the sandbox and where we'll be in Edge of Fate. Overall, I think this challenge is actually going to be positive for the game. It's going to make the damage stacking a lot more understandable and a lot more reasonable so that more options can exist without having to worry about humongous crazy stacking that breaks the game. If all that sounds good to you, let's get into it. I'm Engineer. So just a quick overview. I'm going to talk about how the melee buffs stack and give you a few examples and graphs and all that stuff. There's a lot of buffs to partially make up for this. The change to stacking is a nerf by itself, but there are a lot of buffs to help close the gap some. And then you may be asking, what does this actually mean for my build? I've got all the math, I've been figuring it out. It may not be perfect. The expansion is not launched, so this is all preliminary, but I've done my best effort after looking around some of the discussions and talking with other people and just doing my best. So hopefully this helps you. Some disclaimers first. We could still get an abilities tuning article that buffs or nerfs individual abilities. We did see some of that in here, but I would be surprised if we didn't get some of that. I only cover PvE stuff. I barely ever touch PvP. Most of these changes are for PvE though. For all my comparisons, I'm assuming a 200 melee stat, which provides a 30% stacking multiplicative melee damage boost in Edge of Fate. If you are not aware about stats, I have several videos up on the stat changes and what they mean, so definitely check that out if you're interested. I think that is reasonable though, because if you are going through the hassle of stacking several buffs on a melee ability, you're probably gonna have a pretty high melee stat. So let's get into it. As I've said, melee buffs stack additively, not multiplicatively, in Edge of Fate. So I've done a few examples here. So for a single buff, nothing is changing. You add one to the buff. Say you have a buff of 50%, you just add one to it. In either case, it's 150%. When it gets two buffs, it's a little more complicated. Say we have a buff of 50% and 75%. For the multiplicative way, it'd be 1 plus 0.5 multiplied by 1 plus 0.75. And that gives you 262.5%. Whereas on the additive front, you just add those up and it's 2.25. So not a huge difference so far. Definitely a little bit of a hit, but very manageable. Now, say you get three buffs of 50%, 75%, and 100%. You do the same thing. You add one to each of them and multiply them. That's how you stack multiplicatively, and you get 450%. But on the additive side, you were down at 325%. So pretty significant loss there. Now this isn't a perfect example though, because most melee buffs are being increased in Edge of Fate. So I've taken another example where on the additive side, we've increased them to 75%, 100%, and 125%. So that gets us to a total of 400%, which is still shorter than the 450% that the multiplicative case has with the old buffs, but it is really close. And this is honestly the best example, I think, of what is going to happen. You will see a slight drop in high level stacking, but it's still going to be good. In general, the more buffs, the stronger multiplicative stacking becomes, and the more of a nerf you're going to see in Edge of Fate. Most builds don't do a lot of melee buff stacking though, so those builds will see improvements. Lower investment melee builds will see a lot of gains. One last thing to mention is that the melee buff from having a melee stat over 100 is still multiplicative, which makes it extremely valuable. So if you're doing a melee build, definitely focus that melee stat with your new Armor 3.0. You may have been looking at all that last page and be like, that's a lot of numbers and I don't like that many numbers. And I get it. So I wanted to create a graphical case representing this. So what I've done is I've worked with multiplicative, which is the blue line, and additive, doing only buffs of 50% and incrementing those. So at one buff, they're identical as we saw on the last page, but at two buffs, they start to split just a little bit. At three buffs, you can see that gap between the blue line and the orange line start to spread pretty strongly. At four, it's even more. And as you can see at seven, it's a humongous gulf. This is the problem that Bungie has to deal with, is that blue line starts going up insanely and it gets harder to bounce. As I mentioned, this isn't the full case. So I've created an additive case, but with the buffs all increased by 50%, so 75% each. And you can see that line gets a bit better. It hangs in there until about three buffs instead of just losing pace at like two. But once again, we now have a new melee stat that does add a multiplicative boost, and that's the yellow line, which keeps us kind of in line up to about four buffs. So that's generally where we're going to start seeing the divergence from the new setup in Edge of Fate. Hopefully that makes sense. Easiest way I could represent that, but we will have lots of examples throughout this video. Now, I mentioned all the buffs. I have created a really easy quick reference table of the old value for our melee buffs and the new value. And you can see most of them are going up pretty significantly. We have subclass fragments, aspects, we have exotics, we have a couple weapon perks, and a couple of exotic weapon perks as well. One thing to mention, and I will touch on it later as well, is any existing penalties for stacking, like when you stack Syntheseps and Roaring Flames, you get a reduced effect, or Syntheseps and Combination Blow are gone. You are allowed to stack 100% whatever you want to. Titan's got a lot of these buffs, really cool for them. They are a pretty melee focused class. Hunter's got a solid little bit across Solar, Arc, and Void. Warlock's got very little though. They got a single exotic buff, and they honestly got a pretty big nerf to their Solar melee build. So this is a little unfortunate. There are some buffs in here that will help out a Prismatic Lightning Surge build, so they've got that going at least, but just really unfortunate support for the Warlocks on melee builds. Just a brief overview. I'm going to go through all these in detail. I'm going to start with the Glaive Changes, then weapon perks, general subclass stuff, and then get into Hunters, then Titans, and Warlocks. And for each of the subclasses, I'm going to show you the buffs and then show you the number comparisons. So first up, the Glaive Changes. Glaive melee damage has been reduced to compensate for their higher access to melee damage increasing effects. Glaive melee damage against minors and majors has been reduced by 40%, against champions and mini-bosses by 28.5%, and against bosses and vehicles by 50%. This sucks. I hate this. You still can get to a higher damage level with stacking, but I think this is the most counterintuitive thing. Your glaives are now probably going to hit worse if you don't have any buffs than your unpowered melees. They do hit a little bit faster, but it's unfortunate. As mentioned, this is because they are now accepting full melee buffs. They are getting everything full level. They don't get a D rate like that you do now. But if you don't have any melee buffs, period, you should not be running glaives, honestly, or you shouldn't be using the melee on it. Now, glaive melee does trigger all effects that are triggered by melee abilities, which is really helpful. And there's a lot of fragments and stuff that already worked with this, but it's good to see more expansion to this. They will no longer benefit from some weapon damage bonuses like Radiant that did apply to the melee. So that is a trade-off. Any effects that modify the behavior of the basic melee attacks, such as like Titan's Knockout, that change the element will not affect the behavior of the glaive. It will always stay a kinetic melee, and that's it. Moving over to our weapon perk buffs, the glaive perk close to melee is getting boosted from 30% to 60%. The shotgun perk 1-2 punch, which is a staple of melee builds, its buff is getting increased from 100% to 150%. It now works with all melee abilities. If you weren't aware, it only worked with about 5, and they were pretty medium abilities, so this is huge. It doesn't get penalized at all with Liar's Handshake or any other ability, and I think most importantly, the buff duration is going up to 3 seconds from 1.2 seconds, which is huge. This gives you a lot more time to activate a lot more abilities and makes it so you're not quite as frantic and you don't have to be on top of the enemy. Another reminder, if you haven't been following the Edge of Fate previews, is we are getting a primary ammo hand cannon shotgun with 1-2 punch on it, which means access to 1-2 punch is about to be so much easier and not take up special ammo. So that's a really, really great change. Kind of related to that is Bastion. Bastion pretty much had the 1-2 punch perk before, but it's actually getting boosted, so now it will go from 100% to 300%. Works with all melee abilities too, and its buff duration is up to 3 seconds as well. Monte Carlo has the special melee damage from the Catalyst, and that's no longer reduced against bosses and champions and will inherit all those buffs. That is the Bayonet if you want to stab somebody with your gun. Winterbite will be inheriting more buffs, but its melee damage boost against bosses is down to 20% from 50%, so just another glaive nerf on top of everything, which once again, I think is kind of unfortunate, because as you can see, legendary glaive perks like close to melee are going from 30% up to 60%, whereas Winterbite's only melee damage perk built in is being dropped. So that is just a really unfortunate nerf for glaives. Couple of subclass fragments that will work on all 3 classes. Spark of Feedback. This is the fragment that buffs you when you get hit by a melee. Its boost is going from 75% to 100% and will work with glaives. And the melee damage bonus is no longer decreased when you use it with other stuff. Facet of Courage, which currently buffs light ability damage by 10% when used on darkness debuffed enemies, will now be boosting melee to 50%. Seems to be just melee, but that is a huge benefit for melee prismatic abilities, which is a lot of them these days. Prismatic is very good for melee spam thanks to Transcendence, so this is a nice change. Moving over to our Hunters. First up, we have the Aspect Stylish Executioner, which is on Void and Prismatic. The damage boost on this is going from 200% to 300%. It does apply to glaives fully now, and it will work with all melees if they break invisibility and happen almost instantly. The example they gave is Threaded Spike. If you are on top of an enemy and throw a Threaded Spike into their face while you're invisible, you'll get the full buff, which is pretty cool. Combination Blow, which is probably the most central melee build for hunters is getting its damage boosted from 309% to 400%. It will apply to glaives, which is a little bit unclear. Do you just have to stab them with the glaive? Do you have to switch and do some punches once in a while? I hope it's the former. It will also apply to grapple melee, which is very cool. We'll talk about that again in just a minute. And then they said it applies to Tempest Strike. Some other ones, Athros's Embrace is buffed from 200% to 300%. That is your weighted throwing knife exotic. Liar's Handshake / Spirit of the Liar is buffed from 200% to 400%, so you can stack that up with Combination Blow for even more damage. Ophidius Faith, which is the Solar Throwing Knife exotic, is getting buffed from 100% to 200% at max stacks. Triton Vice's melee damage buff for glaives is being buffed from 100% to 200%. Spirit of Syntheseps is not being changed in its buff, but it is no longer being nerfed when combined with other buffs. And then melee damage no longer scales Scorch or Ignition. Scorches and Ignitions are fixed damage if they're used with melees. Not sure how this is going to apply to other abilities like grenades though, or weapon damage. So just to give you a few comparisons, first I want to start with Combination Blow. This is one of the biggest hunter builds and one that people always think about when you say melee, and generally these have been nerfed. The arc build is going from a theoretical about 4,000% down to about 1,400%. The prismatic build is going from about 3,000% down to about 1,500%. You will notice I have Stylish Executioner here, but I don't have any buffs applied for it. Because Liar's Handshake requires a melee and then the counterpunch melee that actually gets the buff, you can't really activate Stylish and Liar's Handshake together unless you had like a perfectly set up ad beside the thing you're trying to kill, and I don't know, it's not realistic. You could technically do it, but it's what I call clickbait math, where it's like, look at this crazy number that you'll never actually do. But you can still stack in like 1-2 punch much easier. You'll get the weaken from Stylish Executioner if you punch the enemy beforehand and all that. I did include a grapple calculation here, and there are a lot of caveats on this. I've included Spirit of Verity, which buffs grenade damage, and I've included the grenade stat to 200. We don't know how grenade buff stacking will still occur. We don't know if it's going to go to additive 2. They didn't mention anything about it, but there aren't a lot of grenade damage boosts, so I would hope that this doesn't happen. We may also see some reduction built in for grapple. Sometimes they give it half the buff from grenade and half the buff from melee, just to kind of balance out that it is treated as both. But all in all, there's definitely a little bit of nerfs here on the combination blow side, but I will say 1,400 to 1,500% damage is still insane. It's going to kill most enemies in the game quite easily once you build it up. So I think you won't be nuking a boss with a single punch, but you're going to do fine. Other builds I wanted to look at for Hunter were Solar, because I've always loved Ophidius Faith. It was really fun way back in the beginning of the game, and I still think it's a lot of fun now. That buff, because you can really have two buffs to it. It's Ophidius Faith itself and 1-2 punch is getting a pretty substantial buff. So you're going to go from about 300% to 485%. And the main reason for that is there's just not a lot of subclass support for melee damage on Solar, which I think is a kind of big disappointment. Hunter has a lot of great melees on Solar. It's one of the core melee subclasses for Hunter, and there's just zero support from the aspects. So hopefully they fix that one day. As a reminder, the ignitions do not inherit melee buffs in Edge of Fate. So the Fan of Knives is really good at creating ignitions. Those will be a little bit weaker, but that's not really the core point of Ophidius Faith as build, so I don't think it's a huge deal. I think there might be an option to run Ophidius Faith on Prismatic, because you will get Facet of Courage, but your uptime is going to suffer because you don't get the melee refund, but maybe with Transcendence you can balance it out enough to make it work. Now, Glaives. As I mentioned before, Glaives are catching several nerfs, unfortunately. So your base glaive melee damage is down considerably, but with buffs you can't actually beat the old damage. And the main thing here is that they're saying combination blow is going to work with glaives, and that's going to kind of fill in a bit, but you're going to have to build up to full combination blow stacks in order to really exceed what you used to have before and have a melee stat of 200. Interestingly, you can actually get a higher buff on a legendary glaive versus Winterbite, which is, I think, very stupid for a heavy glaive. So hopefully they look at that again and put some balance on it. But I think they saw some videos of people Winterbite stabbing the Lucent Hive Knight from Ghosts of the Deep, and they're like, oh, we gotta do something about that. And they've just maybe swung too hard the other way. For Titan, we have a few subclass buffs. So in general for all of these, there are no decreased effects when stacking with other buffs. Roaring Flames on Solar now increases its melee buff from 73% to 200%, but it does not apply to glaives because this is Solar only and glaives are kinetic. Knockout will increase all melee buffs to 160%. up from 100% for uncharged melees and up from 50% for charged melees. And this will work with glaives as well. Offensive Bulwark on Void will get its melee buff increased from 100% to 160% and will work with glaives at full effect. So maybe there's some good glaive Titan builds. There's actually probably a pretty good interaction here with Vexcalibur because of all the free overshield on it, so that's going to keep you in that melee buff forever. And Vexcalibur also buffs itself when you have overshield up. Lastly, Banner of War, the fantastic Strand aspect, is going to increase its melee buff for you and allies from 40% to 100%. Now, the buff to the Blade Fury Super, though, is unchanged. Nothing is changing with supers in general. Titans have several exotic armors for melee builds, and they are all getting touched just a little bit. As mentioned before, in general, no more decreased effects when stacking. So first up, Heart of Endless Light, the melee damage buff is being increased from 20% to 50%, which will also apply to glaives and unpowered melees, which does make me ask, can you trigger your Heart of Endless Light with glaives and unpowered melee hits now instead of just your powered melee hits? We'll have to see. Peregrine Greaves, the shoulder charge melee boost against weaker enemies. This is everything below mini bosses, is increased from 363% to 400%. The melee damage buff to champions, bosses, and mini bosses, though, remains at 1000%. So that part will be hitting, but because of the stacking, you're going to see a little bit of a drop. Syntheseps and Spirit of Syntheseps is unchanged. Wishful Ignorance, the melee buff to Frenzied Blade and Fletched Storm, is increased to 200% from 100% for Frenzied Blade and 50% for Fletched Storm. Huge buff for Fletched Storm, so that's very cool. Lastly, Wormgod Caress, the melee buff is going from 275% to 400%, which is very awesome. You will probably see a lot of this in Edge of Fate, and thankfully it's finally getting an ornament so it doesn't look quite as terrible. The elephant in the room is Consecration. Consecration has kind of ruled the Titan sandbox for most of the last year. Storm's Keep has taken a little bit off of it, but it's even seen a couple nerfs and it's still been quite strong. Unfortunately, Consecration is strong because of Prismatic's uptime with it, but they have decided to attack the damage again, and that is probably a large portion of why melee buffs no longer scale Scorch or Ignition. So, as a reminder, if you're not aware, Consecration damage is composed of 3 parts. The initial wave does 40 base damage, which is nothing, but that applies Scorch to enemies, and then the Slam wave will do 473.5 damage, and if it hits Scorched enemies, it causes an Ignition. Now, the Ignition damage, and Ignition is normally 750 damage. This is no longer buffed by melees, but it does have an intrinsic 20% buff to that Ignition, so it goes up to 900 damage. We don't know if this is changing though, so right now we're going to assume it's the same. For reference, that Ignition is 63% of the base damage of this ability right now before scaling, and right now all the scaling applies. So I've done some comparisons here between a Solar Wormgod Consecration build and a Prismatic Syntheseps Consecration build. So you can see all the numbers here, and you can see the buffs are actually higher, which sounds really cool. You're going from about plus 400% on Solar to plus 800%, but your damage is actually going down. You're going from about 7,000 to 5,500. It's because so much of the damage is Ignition, which doesn't get any of the buffs anymore. Same for Prismatic. The damage is going from about 7,000 down to 4,500, which is pretty unfortunate. The one thing I do like about this is that Solar is now becoming the more directly stronger option for Consecration if you want to do a stronger, harder hitting Consecration, but Prismatic is still going to be the most spammable. Until they touch how Consecration works with multiple charges and Transcendence, nothing is going to change here. And I really wish they'd focus on those issues instead of still tackling the damage, because as you can see, Solar Consecration's always done pretty good damage, but it's not a problem at all. It's not breaking the sandbox, it's the uptime. Now some other melee buff comparisons. First up, Strand, Wormgod, Banner of War. If you just want to run around and punch stuff, this is going to be about normal. Very small hit to this with all the buffs, which is kind of perfect. Fletched Storm with Wishful Ignorance is getting juice though. It's going from plus 110% damage to plus 400% damage. It's going to be so much fun. I did a build video on this earlier this episode and it was fun then. I can't imagine what it's going to be like now. I broke out an old one, which is Bonk Titan, which you just run around and you hit people with your throwing hammer, and this is actually getting a slight boost. So if you've enjoyed that build in the past, definitely check it out again. Looks like it'll be good. And lastly, I just want to look at Void, Peregrine Greaves Shield Bash, which is the strongest of the shoulder charge melees with Peregrine Greaves from what I understand. And once again, the damage boost on Peregrine Greaves is not changing. This is purely about the stacking, but it's gonna take a little bit of a hit, but I think it'll still be okay. You're going from about 2,400% down to just under 1,800%. So still very strong. You don't really get as much benefit out of stacking some extra things, but it's still good. Over to Warlocks, we have so much to talk about. No, we don't. Winter's Guile got its buff up from 275% to 400%, but it still has a 5-second timer where you lose every single stack. I don't know why they haven't just given this the buff that Wormgod has, but it is still like this after the entirety of Destiny 2, so one of these days they'll fix it. This wasn't actually in the melee section, but Fellwinter's Home is getting an additional effect. If you're not aware, Fellwinter's Home will create a weakening blast when you get a powered melee kill or finisher, which does a 30% weaken, which is stronger than most weakens you can get. But now the powered melee damage will inflict a 15% weaken on hit, which I think will open up a lot more builds. So I think that could be really good in some melee builds. Spirit of Syntheseps gets the full buff for Glaive, so if you're using that on Warlock, take advantage of it. As mentioned before, the melee damage scaling with Scorch and Ignition is going away. So this is going to be a big hit to Incinerator Snap builds, which is really unfortunate because these were not super powerful at all. They were not breaking the game. Barely anyone was using it, and still, we get the nerf. Oh well. Just to compare a few builds, this is the fewest comparisons that I have out of all the classes because, once again, just not a lot of great melee support. As mentioned before, I'm not going to use Winter's Guile on any of these examples. I'm using Spirit of Syntheseps. Winter's Guile is awful. You need a fast turn every 5 seconds, which means you need trash ads all the time, and it's just not good. And then if a teammate kills the enemy, you're done. Whereas Syntheseps has the much easier activation criteria of there's enemies nearby, here's some giant damage. Incinerator Snap, first, you can double its damage buffs and it still takes a damage hit, but it gets pretty close to the same damage. It's just going to take a lot more work, and you're going to have to mix in some 1-2 punch moves. And Prismatic Chain Lightning, this is a very niche build. I did a build on this earlier. It's a very fun one on Prismatic and it's interesting right now because it's the only Warlock melee that works with 1-2 punch. And on Prismatic, if you're in Transcendence, you will never lose your charge of this ability. You can just keep using your powered melee over and over and over again. So that's pretty fun. This is pretty much the same though. It's actually getting a very slight buff thanks to everything we can stack with it and some of the little buffs. So that's nice. Hopefully Bungie doesn't find out about that little bug, because I don't think they should do anything to it because it's not that amazing, but it's still a lot of fun and can mix it up if you want to feel like Titan for a bit. Lastly, Prismatic Lightning Surge is actually getting a bit of a glow up here. It is inheriting a lot of these buffs, and you can now use 1-2 punch with it thanks to the longer 3-second duration. So that is going to give us a lot of potential damage boost. So maybe Prismatic Lightning Surge is the new Consecration Titan. We'll see. I don't think it will quite be that good, but I think it's still going to be a lot of fun if you want to run a build like that. Now, that has been a lot of information. In conclusion, the damage floor for melee has been raised, the damage ceiling's been lowered. If you use fewer buffs, you'll likely see an improvement. If you stack 4+ buffs, you will likely see some nerf to that build. Ignitions and Scorch no longer inherit melee buffs, and that's a huge bummer, but it does make sense in some cases. I think we will start to see more of this. Glaives and Winterbite are getting huge melee nerfs, and it's pretty awful. You can make up for it, but it's going to be a lot of investment to barely get to better damage than you have now. I think Hunters could still use some subclass melee support. I'm hoping that we get new aspects for the subclasses eventually, and Warlocks have like 0 subclass melee support, so I really hope that changes in the future. Once again, I hope all this information has been helpful to you. The table that I showed in the beginning and all of these tables will be linked in the description in a spreadsheet. You can play around with it. You can also play around with the damage calculator, but the math is still a little bit complicated, so definitely be careful with the conclusions you come to and just double check your math before you concrete opinions about it. Definitely feel free to reach out in the comments or on my Discord if you have any questions or anything you want me to check. I've been doing that pretty much nonstop for the last 24 hours since this happened, and it's been pretty fun. I'm really excited that the sandbox is getting refreshed and that there are some changes here. I think there will be some builds that'll kind of filter out to the surface and hit some viability now with this, so that is very exciting. As I wrap up, I just want to thank my channel members who are supporting me. Is Mirage, Sushi Juice, Maddie the Ace, Davey0011, Infernal Park 111, and Aradriel. Those first 3 are brand new channel members, and I really appreciate you joining. If you like the work that I do and the tools and guides, then consider supporting. Even beyond that, I really appreciate all the new subscribers on the channel. I hope you are appreciating the work and continue to stay around, because I will have many breakdowns in the next few weeks as we lead into Edge of Fate and a lot of build videos once Edge of Fate hits. With that, I'll let you go. Thanks, and have a good one.